Good evening, colleagues and visitors. My name is Rachel Baker. I'm the interim Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research here at Glasgow Caledonian University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our professorial lecture, and my privilege to be able to spend 5 minutes just by way of introduction to the professorial lecture series and to our speaker tonight, Professor Craig Thomson. The professorial lecture series reflects the public role of universities. At GCU, as the University for the Common Good, part of our strategy is built around how our research and teaching relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which were issued by the United Nations in 2015. For those of you who have all of the Sustainable Development Goals, 17, I think, committed to memory, which is all staff and students at Glasgow Caledonian, you'll realise in the course of Craig's lecture that his research crosses many of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in relation to sustainability, resilience, inclusivity, infrastructure, climate, but also, and I think crucially, in relation to partnership working, so interdisciplinarity and collaboration. Professorial lectures are an opportunity for recently promoted professors to showcase their previous work and to talk about their future plans to colleagues, to staff and students, friends, research partners, and I'd just like to formally welcome you all here tonight. And now let me introduce Craig. Some of you will know him really well. And he's going to talk us through part of his academic journey, so I won't list every one of your CV points. I know you're ready to get started. But you began at the University of Dundee studying geography, and then that was followed by an MRes and a PhD at Dundee. And then following a period in local government, he came to GCU in 2006 as a research fellow, working on 2 big EPSRC-funded research projects, looking at the role of urban decision-making and sustainability assessment. Became a lecturer in 2011 in sustainability and the built environment, later being programme leader for the BSc in environmental management. And he was promoted to senior lecturer and then to reader, and then in 2022 to professor. He's currently interim head of department for construction and surveying. Craig is committed to research-informed teaching, and one great example is the collaboration with colleagues to develop an Erasmus Plus funded MSc programme in urban sustainability and climate. That programme sees more than 20 students in a 2-year interdisciplinary study together with partners in Finland, Spain and Germany, I believe. Craig's been involved in a number of EU-funded projects working on sustainability through a range of different lenses, and always interdisciplinary approaches, working with engineers, scientists, social scientists, and with a range of international partners. He's led research projects for Health Facilities Scotland, Scottish Government, housing associations, construction companies, and local governments. He's supervised more than 10 PhD students. He's published 85 articles, papers, and reports, and in 2022 became Vice Chair of the Association of Researchers in Construction Management. He's going to be chair in 2024. But tonight we're here to celebrate his latest career achievement as Professor of Sustainability and the Built Environment. Please join me in welcoming to the floor to talk about delivering sustainable cities in a just way, Professor Craig Thomson.
Okay, get the kit going first. Okay, so thank you very much, Rachel. That was a really nice way to start the presentation, and I want to say thank you to see so many of you here today as well. A lot of faces I know very well, a lot of people we work with on a day-to-day basis, so thank you guys for coming and supporting me in this. Some faces I don't know so well, some people I don't know at all, so my name's Craig Thomson, so that's who I am, and then other people who are here from the past, Alistair particularly. I'll reference Alistair because I'm aware to plagiarise some of his favourite slides and pictures that he gave me a long, long time ago. So I have to put that out there. But thank you to a lot of people for coming. And we'll try and name check some people who've been involved in my research as we go through the presentation. So today I'm going to talk about obviously my subject area, my research area, and try to do it in a way that allows us to, present a bit of a journey that I took through my academic career. Hard to think that we've got to that point where I'm allowed to do that in front of people, but here we are. But for me, I think I'm just lucky. I think a lot of academics will say the same thing, that I actually get to do research, I get to teach in things that I'm genuinely interested in, I care about, and I'm passionate about. So cities, to me, urban environments, built environments, I'm very passionate. And if you go for a walk with me through the city, any city, you'll soon get that when we start looking at things in detail as we go. My kids love it, as you can imagine. So ultimately, I think I'm just lucky from being able to do that. I think a lot of it comes from a number of different, there's sort of three words I want to use early on. One is positionality. I think I'm lucky to be able to do this because I've got quite a broad background. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But its positionality is effectively the lens that you look at the world around you from, based on your education, your experience, and your general interests. So to be able to do that and make a contribution by doing that is really a dream. The second area really is interdisciplinarity. We'll talk a little bit about my background as it comes, but I did start with a geography degree, social science degree, and then moved into the scary world of engineering at University of Dundee in the civil engineering department. For a little social scientist, that is quite a scary environment to go into. And I've met Bobby there. That's where. What more can I say? But I think, to then be able to kind of look at research and look at projects through that kind of lens of having experienced a bit of both disciplines is really quite interesting, and I think I can make a contribution that way. The third word is about collaboration, and Rachel touched on that a little bit as well. I can't get to this stage of being able to give a presentation like this in a professorial lecture without collaborating with academics that I work with on a day-to-day basis. Many of you are here. Working with partners, outside the university, like Frank Boyle, for example, who's here from Lindstone Housing Association. People who genuinely contribute to my work, and I hopefully contribute in a way to them as well. So collaboration's really a big part of the story. But I thought I'd start with a little bit of a potted history. As I say, I did a geography degree at Dundee and then asked the big question about what you do with the geography degree once you're finished with it. And that was obviously to go and do some kind of postgrad study in civil engineering. They offered studentships, that was the big difference. So there I was, did my MRes in civil engineering. It wasn't really civil engineering, it has to be said. It was construction management, so it was much more social science based anyway, in terms of the management science of it. And then I stayed around long enough to do my PhD at University of Dundee as well in that kind of discipline. As Rachel says, I then spent a little bit of time working in Stirling Council doing environmental policy work, and then I came here to this wonderful place that I think I've spent now 17 years nearly here. Never thought of that when I first arrived, and through that time, and we'll talk about the detail of it, and Rachel's already talked a little bit about this stuff, I've been able to do what I want to do in terms of being able to engage in sustainability related research, consultancy projects, and then develop a big teaching load as well, looking at all these kind of things as well. So, I've been lucky in that way. So I think probably we'll start with, I suppose, where I'm from. I've already mentioned Dundee about 3 or 4 times. My football team has now moved back into the Premier League on Friday night, so I'm very happy with that. And the other team of the city may drop out the Premier League, hopefully over the next few weeks. So, this is my city. This is where I'm from. I did grow up, I suppose, in Carnoustie. It's not Dundee, but it is nearby. And I think for me, the transformation that you see in Dundee is similar in many ways to Glasgow. There's a lot of challenges in Dundee, there's a lot of problems in Dundee, but there's also a lot of great things in Dundee as a city. As somebody who's interested in the urban environment, particularly, there's just so many things to look at and things that over time have shaped my understanding and I think my passion for cities particularly and how they develop. So Dundee, as we know, has now some world-class buildings. I wouldn't say world-class football teams, but that was maybe in the 1960s. It's obviously a lot of tourist attractions, but it is genuinely a really vibrant city these days. And so I spent a lot of time in Dundee. I studied geography. I managed to find this picture the other day, which I thought was quite scary. 20 odd years old now, our class. I thought what's different about this picture than what you would do with our students here is we all turned up. So I think if you were to ask our students to come along and have a photograph on the front steps, we'd have not that many. But a really fascinating programme. Geography is a great degree. It was my favourite subject at school. It certainly became my favourite subject at university. But I was looking at some of the definitions of what was on the geography website at Dundee, and I actually realised, despite all the disciplinary discussion in my CV, that I hadn't really drifted very far from what is on that page in terms of my interests. For me, geography is about social, physical sciences, how they basically connect in the environment that we live in. And I don't think I've drifted far away from that at all, actually. I did like the way they began to choreograph their themes around sort of modern ideas, but generally we're talking about just communities and places, shaping environmental futures, and then this idea about digitization beginning to become really important. And again, as we go through my research, you'll see that we're still committed to all these things. So despite leaving the discipline back in the day to go and do something else, I'm still very committed to these ideas. I then crossed the street effectively on campus and went into the world of engineering, civil engineering department in Dundee. And I think my time in the Construction Management Research Unit in Dundee really did shape all my thinking about how to be wanting to be an academic. Professor Malcolm Horner, who was the leader of the unit, I suppose, and is a very recognisable professor around the UK for 30, 40 years, is an inspirational character. One of these people that you define as a leader. He very much comes into that sort of form, and he developed a culture in the research unit where people would be able to share ideas and engage and just be their better person, so to speak, and develop. My supervisor was Andy Munns. Andy's still at Dundee. He's a senior lecturer in construction management. He's one of these strange characters who's been a PhD supervisor without having had one himself. So I don't think he'd be allowed to do that now, but he certainly was allowed to do that then. And he's still very active. He's got another role as well at Dundee as we speak. The bottom picture, we've got Dr. Mohammed Al-Haram, who I spent a lot of time working with, certainly on research projects I'm going to talk about in a second. We spent a lot of time working together in the early days, and I learned so much from him. Some other people here, I'm not going to go into them in too much detail, but all I can say is that the 6 people that were also in the office, 4 of them became professors before me. And apparently I was late, and I was taking my time, and all these sorts of great things. but people that I shared a lot of time with, I exchanged a lot of ideas. So Dundee was important to me. And then I came to Glasgow. So Glasgow's a very vibrant city, as we know. Really enjoyed my time in Glasgow, and it's allowed me to kind of live somewhere that is very good, and is also a magical case study for the sort of things that I want to study as well. So Glasgow has been a big part of that life. Why did I come to Glasgow? Well, I came to work on this project. This was the SUMOT project. It was part of an EPSRC funded project, collaborative project involving Dundee, Loughborough, St Andrews University. I think the exciting thing about this project was it really did allow myself to work with a good range of academics from various universities, researchers, and get involved in a very team environment over a 4-year period, back in the days when the EPSRC funded our research, which I'm not sure happens too much these days, but hopefully that'll change. But for me, it was a really important part of my life. Again, I watched other people like Professor Malcolm Horner, who was the PI for the project, lead the project, and again, that became quite an inspirational thing for me. But subject-wise, it drew me into this idea about the sustainable urban environment and how we need to really think about it from a life cycle perspective. And that can be life cycle in terms of costing, it could be life cycle in terms of environmental life cycles, but it can also be very much in the context of the social angle as well and the regeneration of cities. And within the project, we tried to do, I was working with some engineers, so they wanted to measure things basically. Okay, so they thought that was a good idea. I was in the social science wing of the project, and we always asked the question, why? What are you going to show by measuring that? Do you think that that actually is reality? So we had a good, robust discussion for 4 years, and I think we all learned from each other. I think, the social scientists, the scientists, the engineers, we even had an accountant from St Andrews. We all learned from each other. And to me, I think what I took from this project has been embedded throughout my teaching and later research as well. Following this project, I got involved in another EPSRC project, and it was a project about urban regeneration. And we were trying to, in that project, to look at decision-making processes. So how are urban decision-making processes, well, how do we decide, make big decisions for urban regeneration, and trying to understand better how that can take place. So I'd learned loads from these projects. It wasn't all fun. We had to do some work, and I suppose during this project I did learn, how to write papers and go through that kind of development. A lot of my focus was around knowledge, this concept of decision making and the knowledge you need to make decisions. So there was a lot of work around trying to develop decision support systems, trying to actually map out decision making processes. So I gained a lot of skills on how to do that as a kind of a practice. The other big focus was around assessment systems like BREEAM. So BREEAM, you've probably heard of BREEAM as an assessment system. So we looked at BREEAM and we tried to understand it. I didn't do trying to understand the credits and the mechanics of it. I was really trying to understand myself how decision makers were using BREEAM in practice and how it would actually make a project better and how we could embed sustainability within it. So there was some good research came out of that. I then moved on to a range of European projects, and again working with colleagues here, Renton Emmanuel, for example, led this project, and together we looked at sustainable building materials, and we got involved in a nice consortium of partners who were involved in looking at sustainable building materials and trying to understand how we could take them to practice, basically, and how we could expand the market. I think for me, I got to go to Greenland. Again, this is another great reason why to be an academic, because you can do a bit of travel and we can take part in really interesting projects. Greenland was probably one of the experiences of my life, just in terms of being able to go somewhere really interesting and to see how sustainable materials are being used in practice in such a isolated part of the globe. Other projects I've been involved in recent years, EcoMed project with Bobby and Caroline Gallagher. We worked with a collaborative project, again it was to do with the Mediterranean. It's one of our favourite ones, that. We were obviously not Mediterranean, but we worked with Mediterranean countries to try and look at how nature-based solutions can be better embedded in engineering projects. Again, similar to the Nice project, which I talked about just a second ago, it was a kind of trying to understand and take to practice and try to capacity build, I would say. Most recently, we've been involved in the Operandum project, which is a Horizon project, again with Bobby Rahinton, Alexandro, and we're trying to develop, use Open Air Lab as a way of trying to understand how nature-based solutions can be embedded to try and help us overcome climate change. And Caledonian is the big project that we've got going on in the northeast of Scotland. But my role, I suppose, is within this project, and this project isn't to be the engineer, isn't to come and look at the drawings and do that. My role was to really look at the kind of collaborative approaches within these projects that we need to get practitioners involved and also local communities, particularly with a project like this. So again, it's about working with different disciplines, interdisciplinarity, I suppose is the big phrase. And again, we've had some good papers coming out of these projects just to kind of illustrate some of the outputs that we're getting from these projects, which again are making a contribution. The last few years I've been involved in some NHS work, so through the Beam Centre primarily. One project was looking at how the NHS estate, I suppose, strategically manage the asset and looking at how they measured the asset itself. So we've done a sort of a range of work around this idea of performance measurement for strategic healthcare facilities. And then recently we've just written a report with a MSc student who was doing some of the work, and we've got a KT project around this as well to try and help the NHS in Glasgow with their climate adaptation plans. So I just wanted to lay the groundwork, I suppose, for some of the projects that I've been involved in, and I suppose the diversity of projects as well. The final kind of slide on this theme is around social housing. Okay, so partly with Frank, who's in the room, we've been collaborating together for over 10 years. Started off with a little project in Ayrshire where he was wanting to develop a social, for social housing. He was wanting to develop some, eco-friendly housing at the time. And I think we did some reports and we kind of began to look at the cost implications of that. And again, still quite scary when you look at the numbers. But things have moved a long way since then. Then with Frank, we looked at older people housing issues, essentially, trying to develop an evidence base. And one of the big challenges we obviously observed was the data problem that we have connected to social housing and ageing, and trying to think about how we can gather the data, manage the data, and then try to actually make it happen in a wider way. Been involved in other projects to do with housing. We've done stuff with Dana Roger, particularly, who did a PhD around social housing, and again that ageing population theme was there. And then we've done other work with housing associations in the past. So again, housing has been important from our research as well. some wider things that we've been involved in. Recently did a report for the Construction Leadership Council where we developed we basically did a piece of research looking at equality, diversity and inclusion in the construction industry, and trying to begin to understand what, I suppose, from their perspective, higher education providers need to do to try and get them involved. So I'm going to maybe move forward a little bit. And I think Rachel did mention this, and I think this is a project I'm particularly proud to be involved with Renton, Ranuel and Caroline Gallagher and other people as well who are involved, is our MSc in Urban Climate and Sustainability, where basically we take a deliberately interdisciplinary approach and we kind of try to develop a course which prepares graduates to be leaders effectively in this area. And the idea is that they get enough science, they get enough planning, and they get enough software management to be able to be the leaders in practice. And we get students from all around the world, and they're vibrant, they're exciting, and they're good enough that they can allow us to write papers with them when they finish their dissertations. So, as we know, that doesn't happen all the time. So it's a very, very exciting project. But for me, again, it reflects interdisciplinarity and the importance of that for the sustainability discipline. So what I'm going to do now is take us to the world of, I suppose, why we came here and give you some sort of content and a story about cities, essentially, that hopefully will help you get a feel for, I suppose, where all this goes. I think one thing I tell the students is that, ultimately the future is going to be different than it is now, and we shouldn't just accept the world as it is. Reason being, it changes, it's always changed, and it's going to keep on changing. And I think that's really quite important. When we talk about kind of recognition of, about where the future is, we need to think about what the scenarios are, about how it will look in the future. The big challenge, and this is probably one of the attractions I had to looking at the construction industry, particularly in this context, is that it is a low innovation sector. It doesn't like change. And it costs itself in a way that doesn't allow change to happen very easily. And technologically, while things are moving on very strongly in digital and all the other areas, still the culture is very much low innovation. That was my PhD. I spent a lot of time looking at that. However, people in the industry, such as this chap here, who was a former Construction Industry Council chairman and a CEO of Atkins, argues that the low carbon future and the sustainability agenda basically presents engineering with the greatest opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. So we've got something to do here to try and get from a culture of low innovation to taking advantage of the opportunity. And I think my construction side of my research has been very much trying to look at this question and try to ask the question, how can we bridge this kind of gap? We need to make big changes. I think we hopefully are all in a place now that we understand that. Changes can be incremental, so we need to do small changes and take us slowly in an affordability sphere, I suppose. But the big argument is that about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced globally quite easily by doing things that we already can do. And we have actually been able to do for a long time. So the challenge is, how do we get ourselves to that position where we can take advantage of what we used to call the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff to get? But as you can see from this image here, this conceptually still does challenge a lot of norms, a lot of social norms. Trees, for example, are still quite contentious for some people. The idea of having trees on your roof is maybe contentious as well for some people. Cyclists are definitely contentious for some people. You know, that's definitely part of what we're trying to do. But through urban planning, I hope you can see that even in this image, even looking out the window, the campus is beginning to develop a bit more greenery. Cycling's becoming more important. But one of the other concepts that's really quite important here is this idea of density and urban living in a more dense environment. And this is one that culturally does challenge us in the UK. Not so much in Scotland, because we do have more tenements and flat living than they would down south, but definitely does challenge the way that we live our lives. So incremental innovation is really important, and it's still challenging. And that means that when we get to talking about the radical stuff that we need to do, maybe not in this form, but certainly we need to do, this is really challenging. This is the transformative change that we will need if we're going to hit the kind of levels of carbon emission reduction that we do require. Again, this is visually a bit challenging in many ways, but it does show that we need to think differently. We can't just do what we've been doing. And the biggest challenge here, I keep using the word challenge, I'm going to try and stop doing that, but conceptual shift is essentially where we're at. These are two diagrams I show students all the time. Cities have gone through already 3 stages. They've been kind of poor medieval settlements. They've then become production centres, and then ultimately we become consumption centres. We now need to become an eco-city or a sustainable city. And the conceptual challenge there is that while we're still needing to develop, we need to do it while we use less, having less environmental impact. And that is a challenging thing. On this side, we see the idea of transition theory. And transition theory is basically this idea that over time we need to evolve. We've got business as usual, which is let's carry on doing what we're doing. We've got the eco-efficiency 5-year potential, the incremental innovation, I suppose. And then we've got the transformative stuff, which is the really difficult stuff. And again, that has to be in the distance. We have to look at where we're going to go, how we get there, but we don't necessarily know what that looks like. We don't necessarily know what the radicalness looks like because we may not have even thought of the technology that we need to develop. So somehow we need to conceptually look at the future positively and try to think about how we get there. So this is really the theory, I suppose, of what I'm going to talk about. Got some slides of Manchester here. So this is Manchester not as you know it, but Manchester city centre. Back in the mid-2000s, I got a hold of a nice slide from OV Arabs. And Arabs were doing some consultancy work with the city of Manchester. And effectively, they wanted to try and shake up the politicians, the civil servants, the stakeholders who, when they were thinking about sustainability, they thought of it entirely as a new build solution. So they wanted to say to them, look, no, most of the emissions come from the old stuff, so let's focus on where we're at. So they let the graphics people have a bit of fun, and they kind of put together a nice image for them and says, what do you think of that? They all got it, they all understood it, and then they developed a city plan which looks like this. Lots of glass, lots of concrete, lots of quite unsustainable building materials, and have developed Manchester city centre into something that is impressive, definitely impressive, has changed the lives of people, but necessarily hasn't embraced the sustainability vision that they were asked to by Arabs in the mid-2000s. The other big challenge with Manchester that's been quite well documented has been in the city centre. There hasn't necessarily been the care, I would say, for the people who lived there. or at least on the perimeter of it. And this is really where I suppose this just transition concept comes in quite strongly, where we've seen during this period of economic boom, lots of nice buildings, lots of professionals making money, we've begun to see the problems of the society surrounding the city. And it does raise a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions about cities generally and their economic development, but it does raise questions about, even if we push for a sustainable city, we need to make sure that we sufficiently deal with or manage the kind of societal issues as well. And I suppose that's a kind of core part of a lot of the work that I've done over a number of years. Glasgow is doing quite a lot, as we know, for sustainable city. I spent a lot of time talking to the City Council over all the time I've been in Glasgow, keeping in touch with the initiatives, working on all sorts of things with policymakers. And I'm always impressed at the vision that a lot of them have, surprisingly, from some of you maybe. But I've always been very impressed. I think they know where they want to go and what they want to do. The challenge is finding the money, and the challenge is also getting investment from the private sector to actually want to deliver some of the things that they want to do. And I think for them it's always a management exercise, trying to manage expectations, but at the same time trying to bring society with them. The biggest problem, of course, is that sustainability is what we term a wicked problem. It's a really challenging one. It goes across all aspects of life, from air pollution issues. Glasgow doesn't have great air pollution. It has lots of air pollution. They're trying to resolve that. I think even you see the introduction of the low emission zone is again causing quite a lot of kickback, as you can imagine, in the press. Again, this is their solution to not being allowed to shut roads off, basically. So this is the easier thing to do than actually shutting roads off, which is what the planners would want to do. Heat island isn't something that we normally think about in Glasgow, but there's a lot of evidence that even in Glasgow, on a hot day, things are beginning to heat up a little bit too much. Problems in infrastructure, all these kind of things, flooding. I think we know that issue in Glasgow. And then also the challenge of the deprivation of Glasgow is well documented as well. So it's a wicked problem. It's how do we deal with all these different things at the same time in our plans. I don't necessarily have the solutions for us, by the way, but I think the research agenda is about trying to find these kind of solutions. Going to whiz through some slides, but there's loads of initiatives, loads of planning, loads of documents, which are all really good, and I think the direction of travel is very positive. I'm always very positive when I go and speak to them. Circular cities by 2045. COP obviously was here. So Glasgow for me has been a great city to study this sort of agenda. But the city itself has a legacy, which is a fascinating legacy. Again, this is probably where I can see the parallel with Dundee through what I see in Glasgow. Their shipbuilding was much bigger, obviously, but we did have shipbuilding in Dundee. But the shipbuilding, again, provides a legacy of industrial activity, but it has left, obviously, a lot of challenges around the city with brownfield sites, wastelands, and also the community side of it is obviously challenging. So Glasgow has a lot to offer in that context, and this is definitely one of Alistair's pictures here. Thank you. And a few of us are familiar with this photograph. This is a great photo. I show this to students all the time, and I ask them, where is it? After a bit of discussion, they kind of go, well, is it kind of somewhere in, I don't know, the West End, or is it, they go all around the houses, and eventually somebody begins to think, is it here? And the answer is yes, pretty much. This is Buchanan Railway Station. Buchanan Railway Station sat pretty much just outside this window. This is West Nile Street, you know. But I think what I'll show you is a picture here of, and this was the late 1950s, 60s? 60s. Late 1960s. I'll just have to rely on. Late 1960s, early 1970s. And you get basically, you know, really dramatic change in the urban environment. This building's the key one because it's the constant building, and here we are somewhere in that space there. You've also got Buchanan House developing here. You know, the original frame of Buchanan House goes back to that kind of time period. But I think in the space of a very short period of time, you've seen dramatic change in the urban landscape of Glasgow. And ultimately, for me, this is radical thinking. This is radical change. We've got the high flats, or the multis as we would call them in Dundee, but the high flats going up in the background. We've got the bus station away to take place. We've got Buchanan Galleries in a number of years going to occupy this space here. We've actually got a reworking of the road system completely. So you're seeing rapid change, and I think that is quite exciting to look at in a sense. They made a lot of mistakes, I think we all know that, and the idea that they redesigned the city for the car was a bit of a mistake. Motorway coming through here, many people argue it was a mistake. Some people think it was a good thing. But the point is, you've got radical change based on strategic investment. Governments that are prepared to borrow to fund change. Now, if we're going to hit our sustainability targets, maybe we need to start thinking a bit bolder, I would say, to try and think about change on a scale. Maybe this kind of scale is where we're in some places needing to go. Again, we know what it looks like today, but just to show you that nothing stands still. If you go to Buchanan Galleries at the moment, you see lots of plans for what they're planning for Buchanan Galleries, and essentially they're going to knock it down, which is a really quite significant bit of urban thinking, trying to open it up, make more individual buildings, shops on the ground floor, offices above, increase the population around it. Costs a lot of money. 10 years they think it'll take. At the moment they're collaborating with the stakeholders and doing consultation work around it, but it is developing in this kind of way. Yeah, I'm just trying to find a nice place to, I suppose, just to highlight, I suppose the idea of regeneration again is really important. We talked a little bit about the idea of urban cycles, and I think a lot of my research tries to look at life cycle. We try and look at it from an urban scale, which I think is important. So in terms of urban scale, we're looking at 30, 40 year kind of patterns of development that take place. Here's an example of the Gorbals. Obviously the Gorbals is quite a famous part of Glasgow. You know, we're trying to avoid the mistakes that were made here. I think if we think logically and better and make better decisions, we can begin to future-proof a lot better. And we can avoid taking tenement communities, deciding radically to knock the tenements down, build some lovely things like this, which I'm sure were nice at the time, but obviously didn't last very long, 30 years before they started knocking them down. Problems of buildings, design, damp, condensation, but then also the social problems of disrupting communities, very, very strong. Then we've seen kind of rebuilding of the new Gorbals, Crown Street, Old Rutherglen Road, you know, developments which looked a lot more like the tenements and were environments where people actually felt comfortable that they were going into a community. And then from there, we've seen newer developments develop around the Gorbals. But I think what I'm trying to say is that life cycle is really important. So a lot of my research is focused on this, trying to really develop the idea that We have an urban life cycle, we have a building life cycle, and then also we have material life cycles. And we need to think about all three of them. And we need to think about how they fit together, because if we don't, we end up building nice, sustainable buildings in the wrong place, which basically makes them unsustainable by definition. So there's a lot to take in there. I'm just trying to think where to finish. Are we at that point? Just about? A couple more minutes, okay. So I'll give you a little flash of some work that we're currently working on at the moment. Through one of the master's students that we had on the Sue Marks programme, we've been doing some work around circular cities. And this just shows some of the outputs of some of the GIS work that we've been doing, which is basically taking a load of data, a lot of themes that we've developed, and we began to visually represent where the hotspots are around the city in relation to potential for circularity. Okay, so we did he did the work. I'm not going to take too much credit for that part of it, but he did the work on the databases and getting the maps together, doing a lot of interviews with people involved in the circular economy. And surprise, surprise, he managed to reveal that the old Victorian parts of the city have the highest potential for circularity. They have the biggest stock of obviously material, which is a good thing. They also have a social angle, which is very positive for sustainability. In other words, the people tend to live in communities which tend to like to do things together and live in that kind of way. So trying to visually represent, I suppose, the potential for sustainability is something that I would want to look at more as we kind of move down the line. And I think that's a really important area. Another area that we're looking at the moment with Frank Boyle is trying to think about how we, I suppose, help decision makers with how to, particularly housing associations, how to deal with the challenge of addressing lots and lots of environmental requirements, whether it be through energy efficiency drives in social housing, whether it be through insulation, windows, all the different agendas that are coming together from an environmental side, coupled with the social challenges that these communities face, deprivation indexes, all these sort of different data sets that exist around that, and trying to look at it from, help decision makers, particularly funding decision makers, connect the dots between the different policy agendas. And this is very early stage, but we're beginning to get to grips with, I suppose, what data sets that we need to try and do this, and be able to ultimately, through GIS, begin to represent hotspots, basically, within housing association stocks, could be council housing stocks as well, to be able to showcase to CEOs of housing associations, but more so probably the Scottish Government and the funders, to say this is the scale of the funding challenge that we face if we're going to deliver on all these different agendas at the same time and cut our budget at the same time. So it's really about communication, and I think probably that's really where I think there's a lot of opportunity for research in this kind of area, the kind of visual element of the circularity as well, and hopefully we can see some potential around that. Okay, shall I? I think I'll finish there. I've got loads more, but we'll stop.
Thank you.
Okay.
About 10 minutes for questions, which I'm happy to chair. Would you like to remain standing, or would you like to chat?
I don't mind. Are you going for chat? Sure.
No. I'll help leave you standing. I'll just help you.
That's all right. I'll get a glass of water.
Yeah, absolutely right. So it's a brilliant presentation. Thanks so much. Open to the floor for questions.
Just to echo Rachel, it's a great presentation. I really enjoy listening to you. And a good testament to that is I've not looked at my phone once while she presented. I've got two. Do you need do I need a microphone here a bit to hear me? Is it for recording purposes? Okay. I've got two questions. I'll just ask one, and if there's no others, you can come back to me. I think all of us are getting pushed more towards, if we haven't already done so, interdisciplinary working in multiple disciplines and teams. And for me, I find that's been a bit of a struggle for me. I find I put myself under pressure to try and learn some other discipline to try and at least seem credible and be able to talk the language. So you've had to do that your whole life, your whole career, your whole academic career.
Yep.
So any tips for multidisciplinary working that you would pass on to idiots like myself that have tried to do that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, wow. I think, again, it comes from where you come from. So geography was my background, and it's an interdisciplinary subject. Within that, you would always have the geologists, you would have the people who looked at rivers, the scientists, and then the sociologists on the other side. So, and we were all in one discipline, even though it was multiple disciplines. So to me, it was just a natural thing. I think the key is not to try and box yourself in. And I suppose actually, if I really think about it, there's two different issues. One is the kind of theoretical angle on disciplinarity. So, an engineer has to know their calculations, they have to know the theory behind that, and that's brilliant, that's what they need to do. And they can bring that to a context in a way that I can come at the same context from a different angle, not using a calculator, and try to actually have a conversation and try to see if we can help each other. So, I'll be sitting here, so I'm going to use him as an example, but we'll work on things together because he can do the design, he can do the calculations and say robustly, scientifically, I think that looks good, and then I'll help try and contextualize it for our global challenges, maybe is a word. So I think it's trying not to box yourself in is probably the key, and the context is what makes it interdisciplinary or requires interdisciplinarity, and sustainability is the perfect subject area because it needs it.
Anita, go ahead.
Hi, Craig. Thank you. That was a great talk. So we're talking a lot about sustainability. This was a lot here in Glasgow and Dundee. What would you say, in your opinion, is an exemplar sustainability city? And I guess it's not in the UK. So, who are we trying to achieve?
Yep.
Or I'm sure there's examples there.
There's an example there.
And you have an example.
Here we go.
And I was going to ask another cheeky one after that, because at the end you talked about deprivation, obviously coming from a health school. To me, health inequalities are steeped in poor social housing.
Yes.
And from pre-Victorian times, we have not moved away from the health inequalities. In fact, this government has just increased health inequalities, and we still have very, very poor social housing.
Yes.
So how do we balance this? How do we get good quality housing, sustainability, etc., etc.? But I would like to see a nice, shiny, positive example first.
So we've got over here the Webon Freiburg example from the early 90s. It's in Germany, down in the south of Germany. Really fascinating project. All planning students, architect students will study this. Geography students, I think, now study it as well. Where basically they retrofitted a old French barracks site in Freiburg, and a community-led project. So it was a cooperative. The city gave the land to the cooperative, and within there they've developed a lot of self-build as well, really kind of German approach of a lot of retrofit and then some new buildings. And over 30 years it's gone on to become I suppose it's the grandparent of this kind of development. And all this technology has been there and been used in the early 90s. Some of it not so well, it was developing, but it has been there. The UK, we had the Bedstead, which some of you may be familiar with. Smaller project in London, again, early 90s, late 90s, loads of tech. They did everything in this project pretty much to try and make it look, make it look futuristic, I suppose. But I think one of the things that it cost a lot. So the industry didn't like it in the UK, so they basically looked at it in a negative way for 20 odd years until eventually we're coming round to the idea that actually some of the things in a prototype might be quite expensive. So, these are two projects which I think, again, were all done through collaboration. Again, housing association-led, cooperative-led projects, which were all about trying to do it in a holistic way. So you're trying to deal with, I suppose, the kind of environmental agenda, but at the same time trying to make sure that the people who live there have a nice life. So there are two projects which are always looked at. And again, the big fact is that they're not new. None of this is new. This is, a solar panel on a roof is not a difficult concept. Grass on a roof is not a difficult technical concept, but still today we still get the barriers in our industry. In terms of housing, well, I think the work with Frank's been very much kind of rooted in a lot of those concerns about how do we retrofit our housing stock, particularly the social housing stock, and at the same time not cut into other budgets or have the environmental budget cut by other budgets. I don't have a solution for that apart from we need money. Okay.
Helen, you've got a question.
Go ahead. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that presentation. And I just wanted to kind of go back to a couple of things you had on various slides. So one of the very early slides you had was that, about sustainability and sustainable cities, we need to think more about density. But then, we've seen that on some of your very end slides there, that actually they're essentially demolishing some of these big high-rise, apartments, especially around Glasgow. So I was wondering, from your kind of research perspective, is it something actually about the social geography? I'm not a geographer, so I've got that term wrong, right? But is it something about the social situation that's making people want to move away from the density when we know that that might actually be a good way to actually solve some of our kind of sustainability issues? Yeah,
I would say so. It's a cultural thing. If you go to Europe, I've got a lot of friends who are, I'm sure there are lots of people in the room who are from this part of the world, but if you go to continental Europe, that desire to move to the suburb isn't there. The good school can be found in the city, so you don't need to leave your nice flat that you're happy with in the city centre. So there's not that desire to be pushing out to the boundaries. Here we're kind of brought up on a mantra about kind of move out to the suburbs. That's where the schools are. We get a nice bit of grass that we don't really want to cut. That kind of stuff. Maybe that's just me. But I think, the city themselves, the dense, again, we don't want high rises. They're bad for the environment. Lots of concrete, lots of glass, that's not a great thing. But this kind of density, and in fact, our tenements are built to this density. So we had it right in the first place.
Yep. We might have two at the front here.
Yeah.
Craig, thanks for the presentation. I enjoyed it. You mentioned about Glasgow City Council, and I think you more or less made some comments, admiration comments. But I mean, surely sustainable cities should be maintained in a sustainable way. I think Glasgow is embarrassing. The potholes in the streets. And the fact that waste management, just 5 minutes walk from here, the waste along the road, when you walk, everywhere is waste, cans and plastic bottles, etc., is truly embarrassing. One Nigerian student said he cannot believe that how bad in the area that he lives the situation is. So my question is really to demolish the Buchanan Gallery and build a new. I would rather leave that alone and actually manage the existing system properly. So could you please make any comments How does it work? I mean, is sustainable cities good with sustainable maintenance or not?
It should do, yeah, it should be about maintaining, firstly, what we've got, first of all. And then if we need to build something new, then we do it in a sustainable way as possible. I haven't thought too much about the Buchanan Gallery's example as to whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I don't know enough about the building itself to make that kind of comment. If it's being made on purely a retail kind of perspective, that has an implication. That's a decision made on commercial reasons rather than the built environment reasons. But yeah, I think the potholes is interesting because I think, again, if I go to the council and talk to the people who might be involved in some of that, they are only too aware of the problems. And I think it comes to a funding issue, and it comes down to what do we want to spend our money as a society on? And if we want to have low taxes and all these sort of wonderful things, then we probably can't have the environment that we want.
Thank you, Craig. Fascinating talk. Really enjoyed that. I think sort of following on from that, one of the challenges is looking at the decision making and the sort of short-termism that a lot of people are looking at. And if we look back to some of these earlier examples which didn't work out well, it was perhaps short-termism. Do you feel that's changed? Do you think the decision makers are looking more longer term now? And if not, what can we do to change that?
I think at a visioning level in the cities, I think we're seeing a bit more long-term thinking. I definitely would say that is key, but I still think there's a lot of short-termism. Again, development, I'm not a construction person per se, there's much more people in the room qualified in that. I think when you're driven by investors who want to build something and they want to build it quickly, the decision making kind of ends up getting made for the city and for the planners based on the fact that the money goes on the table, and you end up with these buildings going up that maybe haven't been thought through wholeheartedly from the long-term vision. And I think there's a real difficulty there at the moment about how we deal with that. All cities have their visions for the future, and we are making progress towards a more sustainable way of living, but it's going to take a lot of time. But we need to stop knee-jerky reaction decision making, and I think Manchester's probably a good example of what they've done there.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Craig. Thanks for your questions and thanks for coming along tonight. Before I invite you to continue this really interesting conversation over some glasses of wine and hopefully some canapes, I just want to say that was a fantastic presentation on a number of levels, Craig. I think it showed us not only your accomplishments in your career, but also this sustained passion for your subject, which is incredibly infectious, and your passion for collaborative working and interdisciplinarity, which means that for those of us who are from different schools and centres across the university, it was both an opportunity to learn, but also to see these big areas of common ground and potential collaboration. So fantastic. Thank you very much. So congratulations and welcome to the Professorial. It's a great event. I love these events. Now, downstairs, there is wine, and hopefully there are canapes, so please continue these exciting conversations downstairs. And once again, thank you to Craig.